Hello, and welcome to the podcast, Justice Unbound, about women, religion, and the State of Israel. In this podcast, we take you behind the closed doors of Israeli rabbinic courts, where all hearings are held in camera, closed to the public, and where the state applies religious laws to decide the fate of women trapped in marital captivity, agunot, of children stigmatized because of their mother's sexual partners, mamzerim, of converts who did not keep the Sabbath, and where citizens are cross-examined about whether they are Jewish enough, and much, much more. Justice Unbound is written and produced by the Center for Women's Justice, CWJ. I'm your host, Susan Weiss, a divorce lawyer with a PhD in sociology and anthropology, and the founder of the Center for Women's Justice.
And I'm your host, Rivkah, a religious feminist who has represented many women in Israeli rabbinic courts, acting as a rabbinic court pleader, a to'enet rabbanit. Today, we are going to stray a bit from the structure of our previous episodes. In those episodes, we told the stories of women trapped in bad marriages. We used their cases to describe what happens in Israeli rabbinic courts when women come for help, and how religious rules, as applied by those courts, do more harm than good. But now we'd like to zoom out. We want to give our listeners a broader picture of the legal landscape in Israel. We want to provide you with key ideas that you need in order to understand the bigger picture that we are trying to sketch.
Till now, we've spoken about rabbinic courts, where rabbis and rabbinic judges, dayanim, adjudicate matters in accordance with the rules of Jewish law, halakha. But Israel also has civil courts.
In civil courts, Israeli judges sit in judgment over matters that they decide in accordance with modern laws of the State of Israel, not halakha, not religious law. After all, Israel is a Western democratic country whose laws, except for those that we will soon elaborate on, fall in line with values which the Western modern world holds dear, like human rights, for example. So here are questions we will be grappling with today. First, what exactly is the difference between religious courts in Israel and secular courts in Israel? Second, how does a resident of the State of Israel decide whether to go to a religious court or to a secular court?
Third, what about persons of other religions? Those Israelis who are not Jewish, must they also go to religious courts? And finally, and this is an even bigger question, Israel is defined as a Jewish state, not as a religious state, and it is also a democratic state. So why are there religious courts at all?
In this episode, we want you also to go away with a clear understanding of what matters are decided in each of these courts.
Indeed, that's quite a lot to grapple with.
So let's start with number one. What is the difference between religious courts and secular or civil courts?
In Israel, there are two distinct courts of law. Both are funded by the state, and both are given state backing to enforce their rulings, even to put people in jail if necessary. Civil courts adjudicate matters in accordance with civil laws and with no reference to or grounding in religious rules. The main goals of civil courts are those we intuitively associate with the law: dispute resolution, justice, and fairness, for example.
Okay, and religious courts decide who can get married, who can get divorced, and how. All in accordance with religious rules, which do not necessarily make sense to a modern ear. So now for our second question. Who goes to religious courts and when? Are there situations where a person must go to a religious court even if they are not religious?
Any person living in Israel who wants to get married must appear before a religious cleric to receive permission to marry. There is no civil marriage in Israel. And if an Israeli wants to get divorced, he or she must go to a religious court to decide if they can get divorced and how. So the short answer to the second question is that everyone must go to religious courts to get married or divorced, even if they do not believe in God and are not religious at all.
Now, question number 3. When you talk about religious courts, do you mean only Jewish courts, rabbinic courts, courts with rabbis who are only men, who have beards, who decide matters in accordance with the halakha? What about people who are not Jewish? Are there other religious courts in Israel aside from the rabbinic courts?
When I say religious courts, I am referring to the many different religious tribunals that exist in Israel. Different religious communities in Israel have their own way of deciding how people must marry and divorce. In the Muslim community, the Qadi decides. In the Catholic community, the priest decides. And in the Jewish community, Orthodox rabbis decide. And all those courts have different rules. Muslim women can be divorced unilaterally by their husbands. Jewish women can't get divorced unless their husbands agree. And some Catholic women can't get divorced at all unless their husbands agree to convert to a different sect that allows for divorce.
Wow, that all sounds very complicated. Bottom line, there is no civil marriage and divorce in Israel?
None. Religious courts have a monopoly over marriage and divorce under Israeli state law.
And how do people of different faiths get married to each other in Israel?
The short answer is that they don't. Couples of different faiths cannot marry each other in Israel. There is no intermarriage, and it almost goes without saying that same-sex couples cannot get married either. If persons of different faiths want to marry, one of the partners has to convert, or the couple needs to travel abroad to marry in a foreign jurisdiction. And obviously, the only option for same-sex couples is also to fly to another country. There are also Jews who are not permitted to marry each other under Israeli state law because halakha, Jewish law, does not permit them to do so. Those Jewish couples must also travel abroad in order to get married. For example, Jewish law, and hence the state of Israel, does not permit a Jewish man who is a descendant of the priestly class, a Kohen, to marry a divorcee.
Actually, there are other women that are also prohibited to priests, a convert or a woman who's done chalitza from her brother-in-law. We'll be delving more deeply into those cases in other episodes.
And then there are some Jewish couples with no religious obstacles who go abroad to marry. They simply want the liberty to decide how they marry without the state telling them how to do it, or more accurately, compelling them to marry in a religious ceremony. Many Israelis, in fact more and more of them, are taking vacations so that they can marry in a civil ceremony without a cleric overseeing their union. Cyprus, Italy, Greece, all are key wedding destinations for Israelis who want, in principle, to bypass the rabbis.
And what about Israeli couples who travel abroad to get married? How do they get divorced? Can a Jewish couple who married in a civil ceremony abroad just walk away from each other? Do they have to go back to the place that they got married in order to divorce? Since they got married officially, don't they have to get divorced officially also with some sort of divorce certificate from the state?
Yes, couples who married officially must get divorced officially. So Jewish couples who married abroad must register their marriage with the Ministry of Interior so that the state knows that they are married. And they cannot just walk away from each other. They need an official divorce decree and a divorce certificate so that they can, if they like, remarry. And they have to get divorced in Israel since Israeli divorce courts have jurisdiction over the divorces of Israeli residents. They can't, for example, fly back to Cyprus for a holiday to get divorced.
Why not?
People can travel almost anywhere to get married, but they can only get divorced in a court located where they reside. Foreign divorce courts are not open to just anyone passing through. Marriages are always easy. Just book a hall and arrange for a justice of the peace to make your union official. Divorces are always more complicated. There are kids involved, money, real estate. Those issues need to be decided close to home.
So where does an Israeli-Jewish couple who went abroad to get married civilly go to get divorced? In a rabbinic court?
Yes, in a rabbinic court. You guessed right. In rabbinic courts, even though they married in a secular ceremony with the specific intent of not marrying religiously.
I have to tell you, Susan, that this makes no sense to me. If a couple decided that they don't want a religious marriage, and if they went to the expense and bother of traveling abroad to get married in accordance with the civil rules of some foreign country, shouldn't it be clear that they would want a secular divorce without having to go to religious courts and without having to comply with religious rules and rituals? Does that mean all Jewish couples who live in Israel will end up in a rabbinic court in any event of divorce, no matter how they married?
Exactly. And women can find themselves begging for a religious divorce from their atheist husbands, even though they never married religiously.
So let's recap. Any Jewish person who wants to marry in Israel in a manner that is recognized and registered by the state can only do so through the chief rabbinate. If they travel abroad and marry in a civil ceremony, the state will recognize it. But any Jewish couple that wants to divorce, whether they married with an Orthodox rabbi in Israel or in a foreign country, can only get divorced through the rabbinic courts. And those courts are run by rabbis who, by the way, are only men who studied halakha, Jewish law, and who decide if you are divorced only if the terms and conditions are in accordance with religious rules, the halakha.
And now for question 4. And this is the big question. Israel is defined as a Jewish state, not as a religious state. So why are there religious courts at all?
To answer this, we have to go back in history to the Millet system that we inherited from, our listeners may not believe this, the Turks. Okay, so let's start with some history, Susan. What is the Millet system?
Millet means religious community in Turkish. For about 400 years, the territory now known as Israel was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks imposed Turkish law on all its subjects, except not with respect to matters of personal status, who can marry and divorce and how. With regard to marriage and divorce, the Turks deferred those matters to religious communities, or millets, and their leaders. After the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, the League of Nations assigned administrative rule over territorial Israel to the British Mandate from 1920 through 1948. After Israel declared itself an independent state in 1948, the Israeli justice system continued, more or less, with this arrangement.
What do you mean, more or less?
What I mean is that a person living under the British Mandate could opt out of his or her millet. A person could decide that he or she wanted their marriage and divorce to be guided by civil principles and rules, not religious rules. No such option is available to Israelis today.
Why did Israel repeal the possibility of opting out?
It is not clear to me. Most people don't even realize that there had been the possibility of opting out. But my guess is that there may have been Jewish men who married in religious ceremonies and opted out when they wanted to get divorced. They used it as an excuse not to give their wives a get, a religious divorce.
Oh, how convenient. So besides Israel, weren't there other countries that inherited the millet system from the Turks? Did they all adopt the millet system as is without any changes?
Wow, Rivkah, that is a great question. There are quite a number of countries that inherited the millet system, and some that inherited systems very similar to it. Professor Yüksel Sezgin, my apologies to Professor Sezgin if I mispronounced his name, a Turkish political scientist living in the United States, studies how these countries have adopted the millet system to respond to their individual needs and ideologies. He proposes that Israel intentionally left the millet system as is in order to meet its goals of unity and distinction. The millet system in Israel unifies all Jews who came here from different countries, Jews from Eastern Europe, Egypt, Morocco, Ethiopia, South America, the United States. All are homogenized under the umbrella of the chief rabbinate and its courts and laws. And it allows the Jews to distinguish themselves from Christians and Muslims living in Israel and vice versa. It keeps everybody separate and apart from each other.
It seems to me that a modern state should facilitate the ability of persons to get on with their lives and to live freely with the persons they love. On a very basic level, shouldn't people be allowed to decide for themselves how they marry and who they want to marry?
Yes, I think we call that religious freedom and liberty and justice for all. By the way, we will leave a link below to Professor Sezgin's work.
Why do you think the Knesset doesn't just repeal the millet system if it's so bad for women and men too? Why don't we just start over or at least introduce a parallel civil marriage and divorce regime? I know that some people suggest that we keep the millet system because it prevents intermarriage, but I don't really think that it's doing that at all. Israelis who want to intermarry can simply go abroad or live with their partners of choice without any kind of marriage. So why are we keeping it?
This is one of the questions we will continue to explore. I think that the easy answer is that there are a lot of secure state jobs at stake for religious Jewish men who are not qualified to hold other positions. Those men and their constituents won't give up their cushy and lucrative jobs so easily. There are the prestigious jobs of being rabbinic judges, and then there are many side jobs that keep the machine going. Most of all these jobs are held by religious men with little secular education. But there is even more at stake, like the purity of the Jewish people, for example.
Okay, that is a big topic that we need to explore in depth. What is the purity of the Jewish people? But we won't be doing that right now. In the next episode, we return to the sad stories of women in Israeli rabbinic courts. Next time, we will tell the tale of the killer woman who buried 2 husbands and needs special permission to marry a 3rd one.
Indeed. On that note, I think we'll wrap things up for now. This has been a lot for our listeners to absorb. We hope you'll stay with us for more. We have so much to talk about. Thank you for listening to the Center for Women's Justice podcast, Justice Unbound, Women, Religion, and the State of Israel. We would love to hear your comments and thoughts. Please reach out to us on all social media of the Center for Women's Justice, Facebook, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn.
This podcast was produced thanks to the generous support of the Gimprich Family Foundation. Thank you, Hannah Wacholder-Katzman and Rachel Stommel, for your help. I am Rivkah Lubitch.
And I am Susan Weiss. Thank you for listening.